So, folks, let's start with today's session. So, unfortunately, Arjit had some connection problems last time, and we couldn't finish the session. So we decided that I will be continuing those sessions for Robot Framework as well. Uh, so Arjit will not be delivering today. Instead, I will be taking forward the session, and I will do a recap of what previous session had, as well as what we are going to do next, right? So let me share my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, Sumit.
Yes, Sumit. And if you could increase the font.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. So what we see here, so I created so let me first go to this, right? So I created an exercise and TA track. Uh, so I'll send you the link for that. So you guys can go to this link and download the code, which we are going to talk about today. Uh, uh, the first thing I want to talk about Robot Framework is a little bit on the structure, right? How we actually create tests that are meaningful. How do we execute them? What are the uh, different ways and methods of execution? Another thing is how do we create test suite? What are the setup of that particular test suite? How we can create multiple level test suite, as well as individual test setup and tear downs as well. And also we'll talk about data-driven testing through Robot Framework. Once that is done, then we'll talk about how do we integrate Robot Framework with custom Python functions. So the idea is that wherever Robot Framework is falling short of, how do we create our custom functions and how do we integrate with the keyword driven approach, right? There are multiple ways to do it. I'll showcase one or two methods, but there are other ways to do those integrations. So first, let me talk about the structure. So I've created a global directory. I've created a test suite directory, and I've created a utility directory. Uh, I've also created a resources directory, depending on what you want. But for today's session, this might not be relevant. So we'll focus on the global directory. We'll focus on the test suite and the utility directory, right? So this is the structure that I've created. You can create whatever structure you think makes more sense for your framework or for Robot functionality. I'm going to talk about the integration points between these files, as well as the custom file that is there in utility, which is lib.py, right? So that's a custom library file that we have created. You can create that file in multiple manners. I will talk about that as well. And then we'll talk about how do we integrate all these three things together, right? So when I go to global, right now, global. So what I've done is I've created a uh, uh, settings and keywords in the keyword robot. So I'm importing a resource file called wires.robot, which is here. And then I'm importing a library called Selenium library, right? And all I'm doing is I'm defining my keywords. So I've defined a keyword called start app. What it will do is it will open the browser based on URL and browser, what uh, has been provided as an argument. And then I'm maximizing the browser window. Now, where is this URL and browser are coming from? So when you look at it, right, when I call this start app, if I want to use these two arguments, I have to provide an argument list here, uh, which I will show in some time. But all you need to know is for currently, they are picking up from this vas.robot file where we have defined a global URL and browser, right? So when I go to vas.robot, here I'm defining variables, right? I could have defined in the same file as well, but this makes my maintenance easier in terms of how do I define variables and what variables I need to define, right? So it can be based on your environment. It might be a dev environment has a different robot file and a production environment has a different robot file. So based on that, you can generate multiple configuration files. This file I have kept only for creating keywords, right, and nothing else. And was or robot I've created only to create variables. So if you look at here, when I look at the browser and URL, so this is the URL I'm going to use, and this is the browser I'm going to use, right? And these other two are also global variables that I can use throughout the robot framework, right? I can use it in any file and folder wherever I'm importing this vars.robot, right? Now let's look at the test. I'll come to these page elements later, right? So let's look at the test, right? So what I'm doing here, so as the first part of settings, I'm importing a library, which is Selenium library that I'm going to use. And then I'm importing another library, which is lib.py, which is basically this file, right? So I'm importing this library as well. We are not going to use it at this point, but I'm importing it for the whole test. And the resource that I'm picking up is keywords.robot, right? So any any library has to be a has to be a Python library or a Python file that should end with .py. Why we don't have it here is because we already have this library imported in our scripts, right? Wherever my Python is installed in the scripts folder, I've already imported this, and this is already installed using pip installer, right? So it is already in the path. So the only thing I need to provide is the library name. Here I need to give the library not the library name, but the library path, right? The resource, when you look at it, I'm using relative path, which is so that I can run it on any machine. So I'm going to current directory. I'm going to the top structure of the current directory. Then I'm finding the global folder, and I'm finding in that global folder keywords.robot. So when I import keywords.robot by chain linking, this file also gets imported because this file is also importing vars.robot. So I have access to all these variables without importing this file explicitly. By implicit measures, this file is already imported when I'm importing this file, right? And I'm using some force tags. You don't might not need to use that. I will talk about tags. And then test setup. I'm not doing any test setup right now. So there are two types of setups, right? One is test suite setup and one is test setup, right? So if I look here, so my test setup here is start app. So every time my test run, it will run this before running any test. That's the meaning of a test setup. If it's a test suite setup, what it will do is, if you look here, it will run once after this. So that will be a test suite setup. So it will run once before test cases, and then it will execute all the test cases. And then if it is a test suite teardown, it will execute one more time here at the end of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 test, right? Uh, if I'm doing a test setup, it will run before each test. So it will run 5 times. It will run after before verify login, before verify login 2, before verify multiple logins, verify logins and arguments. So it will run every time I start. So currently the active part is test teardown. So every time a test finishes, it will close the browser. So it will run again 5 times, but after the end of each test. Right? Now let's look at the variables. So we have some variables that we have already mentioned in global library, which is vars.robot. And there might be some variables that are very specific to this particular test suite, right? So you can also mention those here. And you can have some keywords that are very specific uh, to to the test suite. So you can mention it here. I don't recommend this approach, but it's just the case that you can do that here. But what I would recommend is that all the keywords should go in a single place, right? But there can be multiple keywords. Let's say go to home. The home definition might be different for different tests, right? So you might want to uh, be more detailed out in listing those keywords so that if anyone else is picking up or creating a workflow, he should be able to understand what this keyword really means, right? So, so I've created a couple of keywords. You can also create keywords uh, at the test suite level, or you can create it at the global level, right? So uh, if I want to define some workflows, I will mention those keywords here, which are very specific to this particular test suite workflow. But if it is a global workflow, I will mention it in keywords.robot file, right? But it might cause some confusion, but the better way is to go here, write your all your keywords here. You might want to comment on exactly what each keyword is supposed to do, right? Okay, so let's see login to portal, right? So when I talked about login to portal, I said we need a username and a password, right? Now those username and password can be already residing inside this, but I don't want that. I want that to this to be a common function where I can provide multiple usernames and passwords. So what I will do is I will provide them as an argument. So this is basically nothing but a keyword function, right? And I'm passing the arguments as username and password. And then I am clicking this element, which is login link. So if I go to this login link, what it will mean, where it is located is in vars.robot. So this is basically a page element. So this is my login link. And this is basically a selector, an element that I've defined here as a CSS selector. Or so A means a link with an ID of login to, right? So if I go to the application, which is this application, which is demoblaze.com. So if I look here, what I'm doing is a login link. So I'm talking about this login link. So if I click here, I get a username and a password. So when I go to the test, when I'm logging in, what I'm doing is I'm clicking on this link and then I'm waiting until the element is visible. So the element is a login username, which is this. So I'm waiting because there might be some time before it actually pops up, right? It is currently fast, but there might be times when it is slow, right? So in that case, it might fail your validation. So it's better to put some not just implicit weights, but an explicit weight to make sure that that element is there, right? And then what I'm doing is I'm inputting text on this element with with this text. And this text is coming from this argument, right? The same way the password is coming from this argument. And then I'm clicking a button with the text login and I'm waiting until the logout link is visible, right? So that means I'm already logged in as this user and as a user with this username and password, right? Now, if you look here, open browser to login page, what it is doing is it is going to home. So this is what I'm using inside this, right? So this is a low level function. I'm creating one more high level function on based on this, right? So what I'm doing is uh, this is my workflow rather than the keyword low level function. This is my workflow. that I've created, right? So my workflow says that I open browser to login page, right? So what it means is I'm passing the argument as username and password. So the first thing it is doing is it is going to home. So go to home, and then page should contain an element of this, which means that it should have a category listed out, and it should contain, and that element should contain text categories, right? So if I go here, what I'm doing is basically finding this, right? I'm first, so when I load, I want to make sure that this whole page is loaded, right? So for me, the best way to do is to find that this element is loaded, and then the text categories appears, and then I'm going to do any other function. So once that categories appear, only then I'm doing this login to portal, which is basically clicking on login and doing all the stuff later on, right? There's one more way you can add username and password is in the argument itself, right? So you don't have to pass as separate arguments. You can do it in your keyword line itself. So what I'm doing is open browser to login page with this user and this password, right? So when I'm going here, I'm logging to portal with whatever I've defined here and here, right? Now these were the keywords, right? And these two are the workflows, right? Now with every workflow, I'm closing the browser because I'm closing at test level, right? Uh, so what I'm doing here is at test level, uh, even if I remove this, it's still going to work because I'm doing the teardown at test level. The reason this is there is because of data-driven testing. So I will talk about it. So let's move to the test cases. Any questions on the keywords and any settings functionality on Robert Framework till now? No. The only thing that we need to take care of is how we structure our robot framework, right? How we structure our test so that it becomes really easy to maintain. Again, keywords.robot or ras.robot is our resources file. So all your resources file starts with .robot. I can have chain linking so that I don't have to i- explicitly import all the files. I just import one file and rest of the files are already linked here. So they also get imported as well, right? Let's move to the test cases. So what test case is I'm verifying a login, right? Now I'm providing a tag login test because I don't want to run my test with the file name. I want to run with logical markers, right? Where I know that this might be a dev environment, so I can give multiple tags as well. But this basically tells me that these are the tests that I want to run on dev, right? And it can be spread across multiple files. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make a unique identity to that particular set of tests, right? And not based on the name of the files. Uh, right? So it makes my life easier in terms of maintainability of those tests, right? So what I'm doing, so my test case says go to home page. So go to home is this. Page should contain element should contain this, and then I'm logging to the portal, right? Uh, so let's run this test, right? And where is this user password coming from, right? So these are the global user passwords. So what I talk about here is this, right? So it's gonna do execution based on the marker, but then what I'm passing as an argument is in that function. So I consider keywords as functions, right? So this is a function, log into the portal, and it needs some argument, right? So the argument is your username and password. I can write text here, or I can just provide a reference to what I've defined here as variables, right? So let's run this test. So the first way to run is that I'm going to run this as robot uh, file. And then what I'm doing is this is a marker to identify that this is a marker I want to test. And this marker I want to test. I want to look for this marker in the whole project, right? I'm already inside this project, which is RF test. So I'm already inside this project. Uh, So I'm already inside this project called RF test, which is this. And then I am finding those tests that have a marker of login test, and I'm finding it in the whole project. I can specify the path here as well, right? Where I need to look for. But for me, it's more, it makes sense to do it in the whole project. So let's run this. So it's going to go to home. So what it will do is it will, and now it will maximize the window and it will enter username password and whatever it is done, right? Great. So two tests total, one passed, one failed by design uh, because there are two login tests here. So it ran two times. One is this login test and one is this login test, right? In the same way, this second login test has been created, and then let's move to the multiple logins, right? Verify multiple logins. This is where your data-driven tests come into picture, right? So what I'm doing is I'm giving it a marker, a different marker as login test 2, and I'm providing a template for it to run, which is open browser to login page, right? So let's see what that template is. So the template is open browser to login page, right? So what it is doing, it is getting an argument, username and password. It is going to home. Page should contain an element. So it's the same workflow as this test. An element should contain this, and then it's logging to portal, and then it is doing a teardown, right? So if I go here, I provide the two arguments in a tabular format, right? So I'm giving the first user as demo, the password as demo, admin, test. So it should run 3 times, but it will still count it as one test and not 3 different tests. So let's run this, right? Run 2. So the demo one is done. The next should be the admin one, and third should be the test one, right? Right. So all the 3 tests passed, but if you look here, it says one test total, one passed, right? It's still counted as one test. So what happens is if I don't provide the tear down here, so my test tear down won't work and it won't close the browser, right? Because it's running 3 times and the test tear down runs only once after the test is finished. So this is it's not counting them as 3 different tests. So if I look at the report, right? So these are the some of the things that gets generated, right? So the log gets generated. There's an XML file that's generated. The XML file is basically used by all the CI/CD tools, and then HTML report is generated, right? So if I go here and open it in a browser, so this is how it will look like, right? So all tests passed, critical test, all test, uh, keyword driven. If you want to dig deep into the detail of it, right? So there are a couple of things that you can do. You can search via tags. Uh, so if I search by login two, then I exactly know what tests were run. And then there are test suites. So there is RF test, RF demo, uh, and all those things. And then you can search as well, right? Now, another thing is you can directly go to the log from here itself. So if I don't go to test details, so this is my main page, I can directly go to log from here itself. So if I go to log, this is how the log will look like, right? So I'm running a suite RF test, right? So this is the time of execution and now the details of that, right? So I'm running this test, right? So the suite is RF test. Under that, I have a test suite, which is RF demo. And then the test that I'm running is verifying multiple logins. Now, this is the three tests that I've run where I'm using these uh, parameters, right? Demo, admin, test. And then the tear down, right? But this is how it looks like when you look into the detail, and you can make sure when it is a failure, it will exactly show on what step it failed and why it failed. So it becomes really easy for you to debug. It's a good big log that gives you enough information to debug your test, right? But not everyone needs log level details, right? So that's why they have a report level, which is basically giving you a high level view of what everything is doing. If you want to dig deep down, you can go click directly from here and go to the report as well. So it has that kind of flexibility, right? So that's basically the reporting on it, right? Moving on to multiple logins, right? We have done this. And now the next thing that we have is verify login arguments, right? So the template that we are selecting here is this one, right? Where you don't have to mention arguments because you are defining it here on at the test level itself, right? At the keyword level itself. So what you're doing is you're opening browser to login page with login user and password, right? And the login user and password, it's picking up from, again, the tabular format, which is demo, admin. So this login test 3 should run 2 times, right? So let's execute this. So that should be running 2 times, right? So basically, this is how you data drive any robot framework test. You don't create multiple tests based on the data. You basically drive the same test with different sets of data. The only challenge here, what I don't like about robot framework is it doesn't consider them as separate tests. It considers them as the same test, which is okay, which is how it is designed. But I would like to see the previous frameworks that we have talked about, uh, what we got trained on were all treating them as separate test and not as a single test. Robot Framework treats them as a single test. That's why it becomes a little challenging because then you have to be aware of what setups you're doing, what teardowns you're doing. That might cause some confusion. If they are treated as separate test, the same teardown will work very well with any kind of setup. But with this, you have to make sure that you are doing additional stuff. Like I put in additional tear down just to make sure that it closes the browser after every line of execution, right? So there are a couple, this is pretty straightforward and simple, but then when it becomes really complex in terms of you have hundreds of elements, thousands of uh, tests, and a lot of setups and teardowns, that basically does cause a bit of a confusion in Robot Framework, right? So it's not a perfect solution, but a very good solution, right? In terms of how you define your test and run your test, right? Uh, mm, Another good functionality on this is on the parallel execution. So it has an inbuilt library called pabot. So when we use pabot, so basically uh, you don't use robot as the execution. So you have this robot as an execution, right? You can use pabot as an execution, and you can split those tests. s- Basically, your parallel runs at test level. So let's assume you're running 4 tests. Uh, so the 4 test will uh, will basically run in 4 parallel threads, right? So if I just run this login test, so I have these two login tests, right? So one is this one and one is this one, which is verify login and verify login two, right? So if I run this, it should open two simultaneous browsers. Mm, That's the issue. Is being used by another process. Okay, so let me see if I can delete this. Hmm. So what I can do is I can basically copy this and paste this in here. I think it should already be. Let me open this. Can I delete it now? Let's see. Yep. Let me try running from here. So if you look here, there are two browsers that were simultaneously open. One is this and one is this. So it basically did two executions together, login and login two. If I look at the result, it should show me uh, as two tests executed, but you can have uh, the outputs from the pubot as well, right? So if I go to log.html, open in browser. So if you look here, okay, there's definitely something wrong with the reports not getting updated, but you get the sense, right? So you have two types of report: the one that will be generated by Pabot, and the other one that will be generated by Robot itself. Uh, so these will be the combined result of all the two login tests that has been executed with login test one and verify login and verify login two, right? Track. Let me close this one. All right. So once this is done, uh, so you have an additional functionality of running two tests in parallel, uh, which basically gives you the details, and it will store in .pabot suite names file and details on uh, outputs and logs at this location, right? All right. Any questions till now? before we move on to the custom Python function. I see a chat. Please. Oh, okay. All right. So the next part is the custom Python function. So what I've done is I've created another folder called utility, and I've created a Python file called lib.py. So what I've done here is not much. I am just getting the time, current time of whatever time I'm executing this, right? So my time is coming from a datetime library, and I'm capturing the current time, and I'm returning that time, right? So I'm capturing the current time and returning this time through this Python function, right? Nothing related to keywords here, nothing related to Robot Framework here. You can do your own implementation. If you want, if you want to really define, you have this functionality called keyword so that you can custom define the keyword name, right? So I can do get time uh, current. So you can basically define this keyword, and you can also define your uh, library name when you create a class. Uh, so that will make it much more easier for anyone to maintain. So if I'm creating a class uh, called util, right? Push this. So what I can do is I can define the name of the library. Uh, if I don't define anything, it, it's going to be this name by default. But if I want, I can define the library name based on my preference on what name I want to call it. There are a couple of ways you can actually use uh, Python library uh, or functions in order to integrate it to the Robot framework. Currently, this this functionality has nothing to do with Robot. There is no integration with Robot, nothing to do with Robot, right? Now, how do we integrate this, right? So the first thing that I need to do in this is I need to import this file, right? Which is this, so that my Robot framework knows that there is a file called lib.py that has some functions residing inside it that I want to use them as keyword, right? So what I'm doing here is I created another tag called login test 4. And what I'm doing is I'm getting that time now. So if you look here, get time now, it's coming directly from this lib, which is get time now, which is a function name. If I'm not defining any keyword on top of it, I can directly use this function name, right? So I'm capturing that time. So basically uh, it's returning me the current time. So I'm putting that time in a variable called result, right? And then I'm logging into the console that variable, right? So let's try to run this. So its name was login test 4. So if I run here, it passed. If I can maximize this, it should show me in console what the current time is. So it ran on 30th September at 7:44 minutes and 14 seconds and milliseconds, whatever it is, right? So it's basically capturing the current time and displaying me that time, right? I can log this, I can put it on console. It's my choice on what I want to do. But this is how you define multiple functions, uh, custom functions on Python and make them as a keyword. I could have done away with all these and just put get time now, but then it wouldn't just for the purpose of presentation, I've done this so that we can see that actually that time is getting into the result, and we are able to run that with the details I want to basically use, right? I don't want to print it on the console. I want to use it further for my further test. But just for the presentation purpose, I wanted to show that this is how it will uh, you can put that as a variable, right? So that you can use it. So let's assume you have some details that you want to capture when you're navigating through the page and use it as an input for the other step, right? So this is how you'll capture the variable. And then you can use it in any uh, in any test that is below this, right? So this needs to execute first so that it can take care of it. Or you can put that whole workflow in a single test, right? Any questions till now? If not, then let's move on to one of the thing I wanted to showcase on the Robot Framework library. So there is a great collection of libraries, Robot Framework related stuff, right? Be it libraries, tools, resources, and where the trainings are. Uh, this is called Awesome Robot Framework. This is on GitHub, posted by, contributed by multiple guys. But what it does is it gives me a detail on what Robot Framework can be integrated with, right? So there are standard libraries like built-in libraries that we are already using. And then you have a collection library, which you can use. You get datetime library, which basically supports any datetime calculation, right? And then the dialogues library, right? Very important. It basically allows you to pause the test execution and allows the user to input manually something before proceeding. Operating system basically enables performing any operating system related tasks, right? So if you want to capture your passwords from the server that you're running in, you can use operating system library. Uh, Again, screenshot, it's all built in. Whenever there is a failure, it will automatically capture screenshot. So something like this. So if you look here, there is a failure because it didn't put the username in, right? So it was not able to log in. And then you have the string library for the all string manipulations. Then you have the Telnet library, which is basically your uh, connecting to Telnet servers and any commands that you want to run through Telnet, right? The XML library, if you want to verify anything related to XML, right? So these were the standard libraries and which you can use, right? And a lot of people actually use most of them because they're pretty standard and are required. So collections are needed in any framework, right? In any workflow, I will need collections. I will need dialogue. I might not need dialogue, but datetime definitely. Operating system, yes. Screenshot, yes. String, yes. XML, maybe. Telnet, maybe. But most of the libraries has to. We generally use most of the libraries from this. Mid-level libraries is based on where what kind of testing you're doing. There is a specific Android library which uses Calabash, so you can run your test on Android. Then you have Appium library, so basically for both iOS and Android. You have Django library. If your developers are running Django, this makes a lot of sense. Drupal library, which is again uh, one level on top of Selenium, which basically targets the Drupal implementation and Drupal sites, right? And then you have iOS library, page object library, Swing library, right? So these are all mid-level frameworks. And then comes the driver libraries, right? Which basically, so all these are framework libraries. And when you go down, these are the driver libraries. So this basically you can use with uh, as an extension to your existing libraries, right? Where let's say you're running Robot Framework Selenium, you can use AngularJS as an extension. It will have certain features which will be based on this library itself, right? So it's not separate from what you're using already. It's an extension to them, right? AutoIt library is basically very useful when you're going to use any Windows-based UI testing, right? Uh, and then you have database library, which basically you can run uh, on different databases. Def library is basically your database. It will have a lot of features. 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 It will have a lot and SOAP request with Robot Framework. So if you look at REST instance, Robot Framework test library for REST JSON API. So the MongoDB specific to MongoDB. So what it does is it really makes your implementation much more simpler because they go one level above the implementation of, let's say, the database library, right? When it becomes very specific to MongoDB, so let's assume, uh, let me give you an instance, right? So where you're migrating from one platform to another, but there is some structural changes in the query, right? Uh, so if you're migrating from one database to another, and the same query needs to be redefined because the new database handles things in that particular fashion, right? The query might not be same, right? The SQL needs to be changed a bit in order to make sure that the migration is perfect, right? So that way is what you will do in that sense is then you have one level on top of it, which take cares of that part, right? So it will allow you to have what that kind of uh, abstraction where you are only uh, writing a, a single line of keyword saying test migration of this table from this database to another database, right? Internals, you can forget about it because it's already handled by that library, right? Otherwise, you have to actually do the transformation and validate it, right? The libraries will handle that for you. So that's one example, right? And then you have multiple. So again, the possibilities are endless, and then we have different tools that we use. So we use Pabot, which I showcased, which is a parallel executor for Robert Framework test cases. So there are multiple tool sets that you might want to use. Uh, DBBot is the tool that serializes test run into SQL-like databases, right? So this has to be installed, right? So this is a tool set. This is not a framework. This is a tool set. It doesn't come uh, by just doing an import. You have to install it as a pip installer, right? So that's why they are tool sets, right? There might be Python files only, but then their implementation is that they need more access from that front. And then you have different build tools, right? So they have Jenkins plugins, Maven plugin, and task, and you can also run your robot framework on a Docker container. Um, and then you have different editors, right? That you can use. Currently, there is an autocomplete Robert Framework autocomplete for Atom. So if you're looking at editors, Atom is the best editor at this point because it does provide you uh, with an autocomplete, right? Which most of them doesn't, right? And then you have the integrations, which is Allure Robert Framework. Allure is the reporting framework. And then you have a report portal. This is again a reporting framework. So it has integrations to both of them. And then you have a Robot Framework metrics dashboard that you can, whatever execution results are there, you can view live. Let's assume that you're running 5 projects. You don't want to go into individual projects and then find those log files and then click on them and to see it's pass or fail. You can create a dashboard using this where all the results get stored there. And then you have personal assistant. So basically, this is a, a a chat bot conversational AI where you basically provide some commands and then it does those perform those commands. This is a different implementation from any test framework. But definitely the extension you can use for any personal or organizational needs, right? And then you have for performance testing, you have RF Swarm. So you can run parallelly multiple instances, not just Selenium library, maybe REST, maybe SOAP, or any other implementation you can run through RF Swarm, and then you should be able to. There are a couple of resources that he has listed out that you can go and take a look. There's an annual conference on Robot Framework called RoboCon that you can view. and find out what's the latest that is happening in Robot Framework, right? And then whatever you want on Robot Framework, this is a single source of truth that you can go and actually find all the details if you need on Robot Framework, right? There are books that are defined here, official docs, and then uh, and then you have your courses listed out. Uh, so and the trainings, right, that are being performed. All right. Any questions on Robot Framework till now? Are you guys able to understand what Robot Framework is and what it does and how to build a basic minimal test structure on Robot Framework?
How come it is so silent today, Sumit?
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's always active and questions coming up. Nadia, you should throw some questions. Divya, come on. Is it all clear? You guys understand? So far, so good?
I think we will have to try it out ourselves before, honestly, before asking any more
Right.
questions. Uh,
So,
uh,
mhm,
so what I'm going to do, the first session that we had, I tried it yesterday with a few issues, but I guess they are minor issues, and I should be able to resolve them. And the very basic test case, yes, I can run on robot framework. But what my aim is, I think, as I explained earlier, we are moving to more the continuous integration process methodology.
yep,
So the testing environment and the test cases are pretty complicated because they are real production test cases. So uh, that is something that I want to achieve. Like I want to create just one basic test I should be able to use in my own application
correct.
and should be able to run it. So that is something which I still try.
Yeah. So the next two
So Vivek, sorry,
sessions,
Sumit, Vivek, you mentioned you are from Rogers, right? Last time, if I'm not wrong. Rogers
I'm
or
from TELUS. I am in the health sector, not in the communication.
yeah, and you're working in TELUS as what?
I'm an IT analyst there, senior IT analyst.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Any other question? Oh, sorry, Sumit, to interrupt.
right.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so what I was telling is that all this, whatever I have shown today, is already in GitHub repository. So you're free to download that from the GitHub repository to take a look at what basic structure looks like. The next session will be talking about framework, and the next session after the framework. So the framework will detail out all the components that needs to go for Robot Framework, right? From the implementation perspective. And the next session to framework is going to be on the CI/CD environment, which basically will talk about how do you integrate the Robot Framework into any CI/CD pipeline, right? So once those two sessions have clarity, basically once you try this out, then only you will be able to get more clarity on those two sessions, right? And you'll have better questions to ask from the implementation perspective. So I would strongly suggest that you guys go through this exercise one time. Don't go into too much detail. It's already built in. Everything is already, the code is already there. You just have to execute and see and go through the code to see if you can make sense of that structure, right? Only then you will be able to understand much better how the framework will work, right? How that framework then integrates into the CI/CD pipeline. Only once you have some kind of a background on this in terms of understanding how robot framework works, then only you will be able to grasp more in the next sessions.
Sumit, one question. In the script, right? So it says like log into the portal, correct? So
Right.
how does it know the page that it need to open? Like directly it opens the username password, right?
Right. So if you go here, right? So do you mean go to home, right?
No, not go to home, like log into the portal. log into the portal.
This one, right?
Oh, yes.
Right?
Okay. Here it is defined. Okay. You missed that point. Okay. So here it is defined where to go and what page to.
No, it
look.
doesn't. It doesn't define here in the login to the
Oh,
portal.
okay.
The login to the portal is basically once you are on that page, right? So my precursor to this is go to home, which basically says start app. And where the start app is listed is in my uh, keywords. So if I look at start app, I'm opening a browser with this URL and browser, and then I'm maximizing the window, right? This URL is coming from vars.robot. So the URL is listed here, right? And the browser is listed here. So when I talk about this is the chain structure, right? You need to create the structure in order to reduce your maintenance on it. Otherwise, you will be defining URL on every test, right? And once that URL changes, you're gonna go through each file and see where the URL changed, right? So what it does is I have some global keywords that I've defined that I know that are going to remain same irrespective of whatever test I'm going to run on, right? So once I do this, go to home, then only I'll be able to log into portal. I can include both of them in the same one, right? So I can remove go to home. I can do add start app and title. So if I can do this, let me do this, right? Now I don't need this go to home. I can directly do log into portal, right? So when I'm defining my test cases, whenever I'm doing go to home, I can just remove them. I don't need that, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's clear.
why I have go to home is because I'm doing some validations after I navigate to the dashboard, and then only I'm going to log into the portal,
Right. Yeah.
right? So that was the need on the use case that I wanted to have.
Okay. Thanks.
This saw Deepal. Have you joined newly now, or have you been joining before the programs? Deepal?
Yeah, I joined this in the starting, but in middle of the network is.
Okay. Yeah. I also see that you don't have a Testoper email ID. If you can send your Testoper Teams account. If you can send your email ID, we'll add you into the Testoper Teams account.
Okay, on which email ID I need to send?
Personal email ID, right? So we can add. Then you can actually see all our. You can collaborate, before and after programs and all stuff like that.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, you can send your email ID in the chat window. All right, Sumit.
Any other question, guys? Please feel free to ask whatever questions you have in mind. We can solve it at on live sessions itself, right? So, but that mandates you guys at least have a look at what the session has been completed. Have a look at it and make sure that you have some understanding of it, and not if not all, but basic understanding, so that the other sessions, the coming sessions, will make more sense, and you'll be able to grasp more, right?
Hello, Sumit. This is Pankaj. I have one question.
Sure.
Yeah. So, what are the other frameworks that are usually used in current market, like except robot framework? So we can use other framework instead of robot framework, because you said you didn't like one thing for the robot
No,
framework,
there are
right?
a lot of things that I don't like about robot. I don't use robot.
No, but that's the one, I think, limitation of that robot framework,
Right,
right? So,
right, right.
so
There,
which framework has that that is the that challenge is overcome in which framework or whatever?
see, whatever limitations are there, you will find a workaround to overcome those limitations. Same with robot framework, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
limitations in every framework, right?
Yeah.
But when you have the raw implementation integrated with it, like whatever limitation I have, right? I can just use raw Python implementation and make them as my keyword, right? The whole idea is whatever limitation robot framework has, you do away with those limitations by writing your custom files or custom library, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the same way, there are multiple Python frameworks that are currently. I'm just talking about Python, right? I'm not going into the other market, which is huge.
Yeah.
But from the Python perspective, a BDD Python is running very well, which is basically behavior-driven development on Python. And then Selenium base that we done earlier before this is working
Mm-hmm.
very well from the UI standpoint. From the API standpoint, Karate, basically Tavern is doing really well uh, for that. And now there is an integration of test project that we are going to do next with Python SDK. So that will do very well as well. But then
Mm-hmm.
each framework has its own limitation. The Robot framework, the good thing about Robot framework is you can do all three in one framework, right? You will have a single framework for your UI implementation, for your mobile implementation, for your API implementation, right? Other
Yeah.
frameworks don't provide that, right? So Selenium base can only do UI. Tavern can only do API, right? So when you want a common structure across your organization, I would recommend Robot Framework because then everyone can shift in between the teams to do API, a UI, and mobile, right? And you basically don't have to recreate that framework for multiple uh, projects. So you have a single framework that you will be using across platforms. So that's the beauty about Robot Framework.
Mm-hmm. So how it differs from APM framework?
So what do you mean by APM framework?
Yeah. So for mobile implementation, like APM is very popular, right?
Right. Appium is very popular. So, so Appium, what Appium does is you cannot do anything else with Appium. You have to do, and it's not a framework, right? Appium is not a framework. It's an implementation like Selenium.
Yeah.
So you need some framework to support that, right? You need some framework so that you're not doing a raw implementation of Selenium, which will take a lot of boiler code, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to start from scratch. You don't want to do that when the market is fast. If your manager tomorrow comes and says I need this 10 test cases to be ready by tomorrow, you can't do it with raw implementation of Selenium because then you have to write everything from scratch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Previously we used to do that because the market didn't have so many choices of frameworks available, right? But now we have frameworks that have one level abstraction above Selenium, right? Which takes care of all the nitty-gritties of whatever Selenium does, and basically doing the validation as well as making it simpler and less code of lines, right? So the whole point of abstraction layer is that you're not writing 100 lines to just do navigate through the application. You're writing 10 lines of code that is readable and that makes sense, right? So if you look at the robot, let me share. So if you look at this, right, it's pretty much readable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I go to click element, then I'm only providing these details, right? But if I go to pure Selenium implementation, I have to import the classes of Selenium, right? Which element I'm clicking on, right? And click can be in XPath, in CSS. I have different implementation of CSS. I have different implementation of XPath in Selenium. It all
Yeah.
combines into one line, right? Same with Appium. It's a raw implementation. But what Robot Framework provides you again is an easy way, an abstraction layer on top of Appium, so that you can basically do it with much ease, right? Similarly, Appium in the industry is not a skill set, right? It basically, when someone is asking for mobile testing, they're not asking for Appium, right? They're asking if you know mobile testing. They don't care about if it is Appium or it's something else. If you have
Mm-hmm.
an abstraction layer on top of Appium, if you are perfect in that and it works, then Appium, knowing Appium doesn't make sense, right? The idea
Yeah.
of Appium, knowing Appium is only when you're not able to do something at the abstraction level and you have to do custom implementation. You can either do it in Selenium or in Appium. In that case, you need to know those things. But it's not a requirement as such when it comes to market. When now the job openings, when they get posted, they don't ask for Apm or Selenium, right? They always ask Selenium with Java, right? Selenium, Appium with Python, right? Now, what that means is that you are comfortable in implementing Selenium and Java, be it any framework, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the key thing. Yeah, actually.
All right. Any other
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No. All right. If not, let's end the session here. Uh, Thank you for your time, guys. Uh, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.